So you want to know more about the Joseph Smith Papers Project. Now, if you are deeply interested in the study of early Mormonism, you've probably heard of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, or the JSP as I'll be referring to it in this video. The 27-volume series finished its physical publications 2 years ago, but it continues to produce online content, which I'll get to in a bit. Over the 3 decades of its existence, more than 600 people worked on the project. That included the 27 volumes, the website, as well as lots of supplemental materials. Just in the physical published volumes alone, there are over 1,300 journal entries, 643 letters, 155 revelations from Joseph Smith, totaling nearly 19,000 printed pages, over 7 million words, and nearly 50,000 footnotes. And there have been over 225,000 copies of the series sold. In other words, there have been few documentary history projects in American religious history as successful or as widely praised as the Joseph Smith Papers Project. It's also quite crucial for understanding modern Mormonism. Elder Stephen Snow, who served as the church historian during a portion of the JSP period, called it the church's lunar mission, a quote that I will come back to explain in a bit later. Now, there have been several roundtables from those who were involved in the JSP published recently. I'll get to those in a bit, that make this an opportune time to look back at the history of the project, explain what it's about. And so in this video, I want to talk about how the JSP was created, how it evolved over the years, give you a sense of how it's structured, talk about how I recommend approaching it as a budding historian, and then also mention some of the strengths and weaknesses, as well as its broader significance. Now, as a spoiler before I get into it, I'm a huge fan of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and I truly believe that the historians who have worked on it are some of the very best historians I know. Honestly, they know more about Joseph Smith than I likely ever will, and even when I disagree with them, it's often a disagreement over interpretation within a spectrum of acceptable discourse. And I'm often terrified when I disagree with them because I'm on pretty flimsy footing. And then at the end of the video, I'll talk about a bit of my own personal connection to the project. But before I get into today's topic, please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel, especially if you're interested in this type of nerdy historical content on American history, religious history, and Mormon history. Every Friday, I do these So You Think You Want to Know More About X topics, where I peel back the curtains of the historical enterprise so you can understand the background to books and dig into primary sources. On Mondays, I do deep dives on particular historical topics. And on Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present, showing why history is relevant. And if you are interested in finding a way of giving back to this channel to make sure that we can continue, please consider becoming a member. That comes with a few perks like early access to the videos, as well as icons next to your name. All right, let's get back to today's topic. As I mentioned before, there have been several roundtables published in journals, like the most recent issue of BYU Studies, that include perspectives from those involved in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. So much of the history and overview that I'm going to be talking about today comes from those firsthand accounts. Now, there is truly one person that we can thank for the origins of the study of Joseph Smith's primary sources, and that's Dean Jesse. Dean Jesse was hired in the LDS Church archives in the 1960s, and over his many-decade career, he saw that division professionalize. He saw greater access. He talks about how when he was first hired, there was kind of an us versus them mentality, and their goal was to protect the records and preserve them rather than present them to the world, and that changed. And then when Leonard Arrington appointed the LDS Church historian in 1972, the first academic historian to get that role, Dean Jesse was transferred from the library and archives to the history division. And one of Arrington's goals for the new division was what he called the Heritage Series, where it was going to be reproducing these primary sources for everyone to be able to dissect. So Dean Jesse very quickly volunteered, I want to do this with Joseph Smith and his private writings, because he got to get to know them while he was working in the library and archives. So his first attempt at this project resulted in the book, The Personal Writings of Joseph Smith, a project that started in the 1970s but took over a decade due to complications, both the work of just preparing a documentary edition, especially when you're just one person, but also some difficult questions that Church Publications was having to face. Like, could Joseph Smith look too human in these personal papers? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should we modernize the spelling and capitalization? Does it look weird if we show these letters and it shows that he's not the most educated figure? Eventually, they went with the more holographic approach, meaning they reproduced the documents as they were rather than modernizing and cleaning them up, and the volume appeared in 1984. But after that Personal Writings of Joseph Smith volume appeared, Dean Jesse wanted to do something more. He wanted to move into producing all of the personal papers of Joseph Smith, like his journals and his letters. And so he moved on to the Papers of Joseph Smith. That was the title of a new project that was approved in 1986. Now, a lot of things happened in the meantime. Most notably, there was a collapse of Leonard Arrington's so-called Camelot, the History Division in Salt Lake City, which was closed and moved down to BYU and renamed the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute. Dean Jesse moved along with them, and this introduced some tense relations at a time when the church was skeptical in general about history. This is leading up to the September 6th disciplinary actions, but BYU itself wasn't quite sure how to accommodate the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute, so there are some problems there. But Dean Jesse pushed along, and he produced the first 2 volumes of what was planned to be a 2-volume series of the Papers of Joseph Smith. The first one, volume 1, came out in 1989, and the second one came out in 1992 without much problem. But volume 3 was going to be the difficult one. It dealt with polygamy. It dealt with strained relations between Joseph and Emma. It dealt with temple ordinances. It dealt with the Nauvoo militia and all the politics of Nauvoo. And so as a result, that manuscript sat unapproved, ready to be published, but without the approval from church hierarchy for the rest of the decade, the 1990s. And there is these phantom references that you found in some church publications during that time, referencing the forthcoming 3rd volume that never appeared. And during the meantime, Dean C. Jesse started envisioning something new. He started thinking of a grander scope of a project that far transcended what he could do as an individual, despite being the foremost expert on Joseph Smith's personal papers. He envisioned something that would be many more volumes and take a lot more editors. Meanwhile, the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute was facing this pressure from BYU to do more in publishing. That's what academic institutions are supposed to do. And so Ron Esplin, who was the director of the Fielding Smith Institute at the time, envisioned, well, maybe if we took on a documentary editing project like this project on Joseph Smith, that would be a way to fulfill this institutional mandate. And meanwhile, at the very same time, Larry and Gail Miller, who were some of the most successful business people in Utah and dedicated to understanding LDS history, happened to encounter several of the key figures involved in these projects, like Ron Barney in Salt Lake City, Ron Esplin, and then hearing about the work of Dean Jesse. In fact, they saw this copy of the unpublished volume of the third volume of the Papers of Joseph Smith, and they decided they wanted to get involved in this. So they donated $10 million, which ended up expanding much more than that with yearly donations, which enabled this project to get the resources necessary to hire more people and to fulfill all the expectations of a scholarly documentary project. So with all that coming together, Dean Jesse having a broader vision, the Smith Institute wanting to take on a project, and the funding from the Millers, in 2001, they received full approval from BYU and LDS church hierarchy at apparently this famous meeting where several apostles and ecclesiastical leaders were involved, and they renamed it the Joseph Smith Papers Project. The next step, now that the JSP had its official birth, was to professionalize, and they had models at their disposal that they wanted to follow. They wanted to be like the other papers projects of distinguished figures, like the Presidential's Papers Project, the George Washington Papers Project, the Thomas Jefferson Papers Project, or other religious leaders' papers projects like the Jonathan Edwards Papers Project or the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. So there were models out there that they wanted to pattern themselves off of. Another big change came from eventually the closure of the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute at BYU. The tensions there became unsalvageable, and they were moved back up to Salt Lake City. Whereas on the one hand, that was seen as a loss. On the other, this was a great boon for at least two reasons. One, it gave them closer access to the sources. They got to live in the same building as where many of the Joseph Smith paper sources were housed. And so they were closely tethered to the textual record. And two, it enabled them to have a close relationship with church leaders, often mediated by Marlon K. Jensen, who is called as a church historian shortly after the JSP was launched. And it would be hard to overstate how central Elder Jensen is to the softening of the church's approach to history and the acceptance of these scholarly norms and a broader willingness to engage difficult issues. Another crucial meeting that took place early on in the new JSP initiative was they met with Gordon B. Hinckley, who was LDS prophet at the time, and they were dealing with the question of, well, we want everyone to read these sources, of course, and we want them to be resources to everyone. We have to have a primary audience. And are we writing for fellow Latter-day Saints, or are we writing for scholars? And Gordon B. Hinckley was clear. You need to write directly for scholars. That, I believe, is one of the most important decisions in the JSP history, because it gave them the standard that they had to follow these scholarly expectations and speak a scholarly language, which meant that this was not going to become a hagiographic or faith-promoting series, which I think is quite crucial. They then moved on to start hiring their first full-time historians, as well as some research assistants, and then eventually they received training and accreditation from the National Historical Publications and Records Committee in 2004, which kind of gave the impromptu. That is the top documentary editing center in the nation. So that meant that they are following the blue ribbon standards of expectations as any scholarly resource. Now, there was some debate over what press should publish the JSP, and they had advanced discussions with several university presses that were interested, like Oxford, Yale, and Princeton. But eventually, these university presses who were entering into a difficult period and not being willing to enter into a 20-year-long contract, there were questions of control. So instead of going with these university presses, they created their own press, the Church Historians Press, which gave them full control over timetable, content, and quality. And I think those of you who have encountered the JSP volumes know the quality that came with it. I'll talk about that in a minute. Then they created a number of series for the project. So there was going to be the overall umbrella of the Joseph Smith Papers project, but there were going to be different series into which the documents would fit. The series were the journals, so the journals created by Joseph Smith or under Joseph Smith's direction. Histories, which were the histories created either by Joseph Smith or under Smith's direction. The administration, just one volume, that was the Council of 50, although online, the administration series also includes the Kirtland minutes, Nauvoo City Council minutes, other minutes of those councils. The Revelations and Translations series, which includes his revelations as well as the Book of Mormon and Bible material. And then finally, the bread and butter of the JSP were the Documents series, which is placing all the documents of Joseph Smith in chronological order. That series, which is a majority of the volumes in the entirety of the JSP, is often, I would argue, the spine of the project and the most important. The first volume in the JSP finally appeared in 2008. It was the first volume of the Journals series. And while much of the content in the volume, meaning the content from the journals itself, was previously available in the Papers of Joseph Smith series by Gene Jesse, this showed the new attention to detail and quality of scholarly standards. It was beautifully produced, just like all the other volumes, large, and it had scholarly footnotes. There were debates about how much detail they can go to. In fact, Journals Volume 1 includes one toe note, which includes when we have so much information in a footnote that we need to footnote the footnote. That's where you get a toe note. It also sold remarkably well, with over 60,000 copies sold, which was unheard of for scholarly documentary editions. Most Latter-day Saints wanted to get into the craze, which was understandable. Now, the other volumes aren't going to follow that standard, but it showed that there was interest in these documentary editions. It was around this time that the first major bombshell that showed the potential of this series came about. At the 2006 Mormon History Association meeting in Casper, Wyoming, a number of the JSP employees gathered in a hotel room, and they were told of a document that no scholar actually knew existed. The Book of Commandments and Revelations, a manuscript book that contains some of the earliest drafts we have of Joseph Smith's revelations. This was in some ways a test case to see what would happen when these scholars were granted access to sources that were previously restricted to researchers, and it was later published as the first volume in the Revelations in Translation series, with a full-page, high-resolution and quality facsimiles along with the transcript. The success of that volume laid the groundwork for other document transfers out of the First Renzi Vault to the Church History Library and eventually the public, like the Council of 50, which eventually was published by the JSP in 2016. Now, in 2010, just a couple of years after the project had its first volume out, they have a couple others that following, there was a moment of key transition. This was during a time of massive economic recession in America. And so there's a question of, can we actually invest in this pricey project, especially if they wanted to reach their goal of publishing 2 volumes a year. Now, especially now that once you're getting to the later years of Joe Smith, there are so many documents, it was just going to take a lot more manpower. And it was during that climate that Gail Miller, who is now a widow, Larry H. Miller had passed away shortly before, pledged more money to the project that allowed them to hire more scholars so they can devote full time and meet this project's standards and goal. A very significant financial decision that I think should be lauded as an investment in this private research. Eventually, the Joe Smith Papers Project accumulated the largest group of PhD historians who specialize in American religion in probably the country. And I don't say that lightly. The JSP becomes a large accumulation of some of the best and brightest dedicated to researching Joseph Smith's life. They also soon realized that this project wasn't going to be able to be as comprehensive because there are just way too many documents that they could fit, and a bit more selective. But what allowed that decision was the rise of the website for the Joe Smith Papers Project. Because even if they couldn't talk about all the documents or provide transcripts of all the documents online, for instance, all the priesthood licenses that Joe Smith signed, or all the city council decisions that he oversaw as mayor, all those documents could go online, which you can now read for free. Now, one of the questions I often get asked when talking about the Joe Smith Papers Project is, why did it take so long for them to put out all these volumes? I see other documentary histories that come out a lot quicker. JSP has an army of talented scholars. Why does it take so long? Well, one, the standards involved with that type of documentary editing takes quite a while. You have to seek, categorize, define the documents. Then it goes through several stages of transcription and verification to make sure that every single letter or symbol is correct. And then there is background research on every single issue or person or place that's mentioned in the text to an extraordinary degree. I once heard the story of someone who had to spend weeks digging into the average prices for horses so that we could understand, when Joseph Smith bought Old Major, how does it fit into the broader American market? And that was repeated with, nearly every mention of a random reference in these sources. And then there are layers of reviews, both the scholarly review and the ecclesiastical review. So in other words, this type of standard, this quality of work takes time. And that's why it took 2 decades. And they finally finished their 27th and final published volume in 2023, even while they're still putting more material online now. The significance of this project for the scholarly world, those of us over-specialized nerds who are interested in this topic, should be quite clear. But the significance of this project to the LDS Church can sometimes be overlooked. And there are some direct impacts that the JSP had on the church. So, for instance, in 2013, the LDS Church produced new editions of their scriptures, and that included 80 section headings for Doctrine and Covenants Revelations that were revised based on material produced by the Joe Smith Papers Project. JSP material was also incorporated into LDS curriculum. It served as the foundation for Saints Volume 1. In fact, I would argue that the Saints volumes would not exist were it not for the success for the Joseph Smith Papers project, but the Saints volumes has a different goal and different types of standards that maybe I'll get into at a different point. It also meant more public outreach and connections to academics. It built bridges to an academic community after many of those bridges had been burned in the 1990s due to the September 6th and the ideological warfare against scholarly history. The JSP is also significant because it forced LDS leaders to confront difficult issues regarding history in general and Joseph Smith in particular. This is actually one of the benefits of the review process. We can understand the downsides of the review process of LDS apostles in the First Presidency having to read through and sign off on all these volumes before they're published, one of the reasons why it might take a while. But the benefits is that it forced the LDS First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to read all the latest scholarship on Joseph Smith, making sure they're aware of the issue, because I don't know how aware they actually were before that. The leaders of the JSP and the Church History Library also met with the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 frequently, introducing them to various topics, and so there was much more of a connection, a dialogue taking place with LDS leaders and top scholars. One example of an outcome of that is like the Seer Stones. I don't think the LDS Church would have finally embraced the Seer Stones as the primary tools used to translate the Book of Mormon had it not for the dialogues commenced over the Joseph Smith Papers project. So now, and it also led to the transfer of more important documents from the LDS First Presidency ownership to the Church History Library. So just recently, the John Taylor 1886 revelation, that's in many ways the result of these decades of work of scholars enabled by the Joseph Smith Papers project to convince LDS leaders to transfer these previously sequestered documents. This is why Elder Stephen Snow, who is a church historian during a portion of this time, said that the JSP was the lunar mission. What he meant by that is America often speaks of the lunar mission as this great boon for scientific and technological studies, because beyond allowing astronauts to make it to the moon, there were lots of side discoveries that enabled American science and technology to progress beyond just spacecraft. The same can be true about the Joseph Smith Papers project. There were lots of side benefits and the spread of more knowledge beyond just what appeared in those volumes. Okay, so how do you use the JSP if you're interested? Well, if you're a nerd's nerd like me, you can accumulate all the print volumes. Here is an image of all my volumes on the shelf in my living room that I frequently use when I work on stuff. It's often the first stop I'm making when I'm doing something related to early Mormonism. But you don't need to shell out the money for the volumes. All the material is available online for free at their very intuitive and useful website, josephsmithpapers.com. There's a number of resources you can find online, besides just high quality resolution images of all of Joseph Smith's documents. There is supplemental material like a calendar of documents that allows you to walk through a general time frame to understand. This, I argue, is one of the most important things that historians can do, or when you're wanting to understand historical context, is put everything in a chronological order and see how they fit. Well, the JSP has done that for you. There's annotations and introductions for not just general series, but also particular documents. You can pull up a document, you can open up the document introduction, and you can see lots of background, the deep digging that all of these qualified scholars did to understand every name, event, episode, or place that is mentioned in that document. A lot of that work is already done for you. There's a glossary of places. There's a glossary of people. There's a search function. If you are interested in a particular person in early Mormonism, look to their glossary of people. There may be an entry and you can see how that person appeared in Joseph Smith related documents. So in many ways, the JSP captures far more people than just Joseph Smith. So you can understand about early Mormonism writ large. There's also deep scholarly analysis produced by the Mormonism's best nerds on topics that are really difficult to digest. Let me give a couple examples. Legal and financial considerations in Joseph Smith are deep, dense, and complicated. They require a knowledge of law and context and all these things that, frankly, I and many others don't have the time to dig. But there is analysis and introductions from people who have spent years on those topics, dedicated to understanding Joseph Smith's legal and financial matters, who provide introductions on that material. And all of that is available online. So even though it's directed at scholars, and even if it fits within ecclesiastical limits, it's still useful for just a general interest on the topic. And I would argue that all interpretations that you might find on the JSP, even those with which I would disagree, all fit within the spectrum of responsible scholarship. And that's why it's such a great resource. Now, of course, there are limits. There is no way to be perfectly aligned with academic scholarly standards of transparency and also fit within an ecclesiastical hierarchy where these historical truths have doctrinal implications. So in other words, you can't always pledge allegiance to both the academy and the church, and so there are therefore some ecclesiastical limits placed in the materials in the JSP. Though, as I hope is clear in my discussion, those are few and far between, and all the interpretations fit within the spectrum of responsible discourse. So while the scholars who work on the JSP are the best possible historians to work on that, they work within institutional confines that have to be kept in mind. Let me just give two brief examples. So for instance, in Journals Volume 2, so covers the early Nauvoo period, the introduction has a whole section discussing John C. Bennett and why John C. Bennett's spiritual wifery is different from Joseph Smith's polygamy. I felt that some of that analysis goes beyond the scholarly standard of trying to differentiate in order to preserve Joseph Smith's character as compared to John C. Bennett, whereas, from an academic perspective, John C. Bennett and Joseph Smith's actions aren't as different as, the devotional context might want to assume. So that's one example of limits. The other is in the Council of 50 volume, dealing with the last charge, or Joseph Smith rolling off the authority to leave the church from himself to the Quorum of the 12, a narrative that Brigham Young and others argued in their attempt to become the new church leaders, the topic of a video I did a couple weeks ago. Now, LDS Quorum of the 12 later said that took place during a certain time period, and when LDS Church historians got access to the Council of 50, they expected to find that record of the last charge there. It wasn't. So instead, for the March 26, 1844 date, which they believe is the most likely date in their minds that Joseph Smith gave the Quorum of the 12 that authority, there is a long footnote speculating that this is actually what happened, even though it's not captured. Again, that's an institutional priority that may not fully fit academic standards. But I want to emphasize that those types of exceptions are the exceptions to prove the rule, because a majority of the Joseph Smith Papers Project is the phenomenal, as best as we could expect, contextualization and analysis. I just sometimes wish we had a bit more. I always wish we would see like a list of plural wives that come from the JSP so we can actually use that to a much easier extent, especially with the unfortunate number of people who don't accept the historical consensus that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. But again, those are nitpicks. Overall, the JSP is phenomenal. All right, a few suggestions on how you can go out and read more about this yourself if you're interested. First and foremost, go to the Joseph Smith Papers Project website itself. If you haven't played around there, you're really missing out. But second, I want to highlight a few of these roundtables that I've mentioned that have come out that give first-person accounts of the origins and development and the structure of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. The most recent issue of BYU Studies, Volume 64, Issue 3, published this summer in 2025, includes one essay by Matt Godfrey, Getting to Know Brother Joseph, which is a general overview, and it's within a devotional context, but that's to be expected, how the JSP can allow you to better understand Joseph Smith. And then there are several roundtables that I strongly recommend. One is the genesis of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, a roundtable with Richard Bushman, Ronald Espin, Dean Jesse, and Rick Turley, who is the assistant church historian during this time. Bushman, of course, famous for being the Rough Stone Rolling. He played an influential role in the creation of the JSP. That's a phenomenal overview of the genesis. Another roundtable is behind the scenes of the Joseph Smith Papers Project with several of the phenomenal volume editors, Robin Jensen, Mark Ashers McGee, Jeffrey Mahas, Sherilyn Harcroft, Elizabeth Keene and Jessica Nelson, who provide background on how they produce these volumes and how it changed. An excellent looking behind the curtain of the project. And then another roundtable in the volume, in that issue, is how the Joseph Smith Papers became a project of consequence, which is a discussion between Ronald Espin, again, he was the director of the Smith Institute, Ronald Barney, who was a key player at the Church History Library, Gail Miller, speaking about how the Millers came to fund all of it, and then Marlin Jensen, the church historian who was so influential. And then one other roundtable that appeared in a Journal of Mormon History volume this year, volume 52, number 1, April 2005, is how the history and impact of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which includes the scholars Grant Underwood, Dean Jesse, Matt Groh, Matt Godfrey, Sherilyn Harcroft, and Elder Kyle McKay, who is the current LDS church historian. All of those will give you more background to the JSP. Now, I want to close by talking about my own personal connection. When I was an undergraduate student at BYU, I was very fortunate to be hired by the JSP to be a research assistant, a job that I held for about 2.5 years. I looked to that job, which enabled me to just track down different sources and provide assistance to the documentary editors. I look at that job as the origins of my time as a historian. Those historians served as mentors to me, so I'm biased toward them. But I truly saw with my own eyes the great work that I did, and I took pride in the very minuscule portion that I played and seeing what it became. I mean, it's just a truly, truly phenomenal project. All the nerds know that the JSP is where it's at. So if you haven't explored it yourself, I strongly recommend. And if you've explored it but didn't know the background, I hope this video helped. The JSP shows why history remains relevant for today, why it's worth investigating. And I truly believe that JSP is one of the best scholarly projects and also a foundational moment for modern Mormonism. I hope this video made sense. If so, like the video and share with others. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, especially if you enjoy this type of nerdy historical analysis. And if you're interested in giving back, you can become a member to the channel as well. History, you won't be surprised me saying, has never been more relevant than it is now, which is why this project and these types of discussions are so important.